have a full agenda, lots of great presentations to hear from members of our own team from the State Board of Education, and we have Michael Durline from the Tennessee Department of Education. I know David Donaldson is on the line. I'm not sure if he's part of a presentation or they're here with us to answer questions, but I'm glad that you're joining us today. So let's go ahead and get started with moving into a few remarks from Dr. Sarah Morrison, who is our Executive Director of the State Board of Education. Dr. Sarah?
Yes, thank you, Lillian. Great to see all of you. It's great when technology works, and appreciate our team for troubleshooting through our platform. We're all learning in this new environment, but it's really good to be together, and I'm excited for our agenda today. Been working with our team, with Amy Owen and Erica Light in particular, and with the Department of Education, David Donaldson and Michael Durline. We've got some really interesting discussions ahead of us, I think, today, starting with some data that Erica has compiled to share on the EDTPA scores coming out of our institutions across the state, some good discussion that I know we'll have there. We'll be talking to you about this year's educator report card that was released in February. And then we'll turn to our colleagues at the Department of Education and hear from Michael Durline on the status of the annual reports, which, as you know, are the complementary report to the report card that's in more detail and really provides that sort of improvement tool, reflection tool for institutions as they think about their data each year. And I know they have some other updates for you as well, one on math licensure that I think will be of interest. And then we'll close out with some comments from Amy Owen and from Michael Durline about what you can expect in a few weeks on the May meeting agenda relevant to licensure and preparation. So it's a full agenda. I think we'll be able to accomplish it all within our time frame, but that's all for me. I'm just glad that we could all be together and look forward to the discussion. So thank you, Madam Chair. I will turn it back to you.
Thank you so much for those remarks. And I'm glad we did not have an opportunity to discuss this, but I was going to say similar comments. So rather than repeat what she just said, I'm thankful to our team of presenters for the great work that they've done in advance of preparing for this meeting. So let's go ahead and dive in with our first presentation from Erica Light on EDTPA research and trends in Tennessee. Erica?
Okay. I'm going to share my screen. You should all see the PowerPoint, same slide as before, except that now it's on my computer so that I can control it.
Are you able to zoom in just a little, Erica?
Yes, I will do that.
Thank you.
Is that better?
Yes,
or
great.
Is that too big?
I think that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to be speaking today about an analysis I've done of the EDTPA qualifying scores in Tennessee. So just for the record, I'm Erica Light, Senior Research Associate for the State Board of Education, and I'll start out just by talking about some of the motivation for why we decided to do this analysis. So we looked at this topic a couple of years ago, and we've decided to revisit it because in the meantime, EDTPA has become a statewide licensure requirement. It became a requirement for the vast majority of endorsement areas starting on January 1st, 2019. We've also heard some concerns about EDTPA, particularly from a few of our EPPs at last year's TACTI conference. And particularly, these were related to the potential impact on candidates of color. So that's one thing that we're going to be addressing during this presentation. First, I'll start off by just discussing a little bit about what is EDTPA. EDTPA is a performance-based assessment of teaching. It was originally developed at Stanford University. So it is a scored assessment, but it's not like multiple choice assessment where you just go into a test center and you answer questions and then you get a score. You actually develop a portfolio throughout your student teaching or internship placement in which the teacher candidate collects lesson plans, samples of student work and assessments, and they also submit videos of themselves delivering instruction. They submit this portfolio to Pearson, which is the scorer of EDTPA, and then trained scorers who are either teachers themselves or our teacher preparation faculty score each EDTPA portfolio. The EDTPA is offered in 28 different subject areas. However, it's primarily a pedagogical assessment rather than a content area assessment. So about 80% of the assessment is the same across all the subject areas, with only 20% being subject specific. This is important to note because although it does come in many different subject areas, it's not a substitute for a content knowledge exam. And also, if you are seeking multiple endorsements with your initial licensure, you would only need to do the one EDTPA exam. So some background information on the timeline for these requirements.
Okay. Madam, can I ask a question?
I'm fine with asking a question if Chairman Hartgrove is okay with that.
Yes, yes, go ahead, please proceed.
Help me understand what you just said, that EDTPA is not a substitute for content assessment, but also said that if you're going to get endorsed in multiple areas, it would be EDTPA.
So EDTPA is not a substitute for content assessment in that you still need to take the content assessment for each endorsement area you're seeking. So if I'm trying to become a high school teacher and I want to be endorsed in both history and government, I would need to take only one EDTPA, but I would still need to take the praxis content assessments in both history and government.
I got it.
Okay, so some background information about the requirements for EDTPA. We had back in October 2016, that was when the board initially passed an update to the professional assessment policy, which would require educator candidates to pass the EDTPA performance assessment. But that requirement did not come into effect immediately. It came into effect on January 1st, 2019. In the meantime, in October 2018, the board updated the policy to allow a gradual ramping up of the qualifying score from 37 to 42. The reasoning behind that is that we had seen some data coming from other states and also from early adopters of EDTPA in Tennessee, indicating that there's a significant learning curve for EPPs when they first start implementing EDTPA with their candidates, since it is very different from the multiple choice pedagogical assessment that they'd been doing before. So that was the reasoning for having the gradual ramping up of the cut score. Until January 1st, 2019, teacher candidates could submit either a qualifying score on the Praxis Principles of Learning and Teaching assessment, which is the previous pedagogical assessment, or they could submit an EDTPA score. And EPPs at that time could set their own EDTPA qualifying scores as long as it was at or above the state minimum of 37. Then starting on January 1st, 2019, EDTPA is now a requirement for nearly all endorsement areas. There are a few CTE endorsement areas that don't have an appropriate EDTPA, and so those candidates may still take the praxis, but everyone else pretty much has to do the EDTPA. On the next slide, it shows the progression of the qualifying scores in Tennessee. So there are, as mentioned previously, several different subject areas of EDTPA. Most of those subject areas have 15 rubrics, and you receive a score between 1 and 5 for each rubric. So the range of possible scores is 15 to 75. However, there are a few tests that have a different number of rubrics. So world languages and classical languages have 13 rubrics. So they have a different possible score range. And elementary education, literacy, and mathematics has 18 rubrics. And just to clarify, not all elementary education candidates take the literacy and mathematics test. they can also, there are separate elementary education literacy and elementary education mathematics assessments, each of which have 15 rubrics. And currently, elementary teachers only need to do, they would only need to do one of those. So some of them pick one or the other, and some of them do the combined literacy and mathematics that has 18 rubrics. But again, they would still need to pass the content assessment. So that doesn't mean that they don't have content knowledge in the other area. So currently, because we're between January 1st and December 31st, 2020, we're on a cut score of 40 for the majority of EDTPA exams. And as the policy is currently written, the cut score will increase to 42 on January 1st, 2021. The reasoning behind 42 is that this is the recommended performance standard from the makers of EDTPA. However, the makers of EDTPA don't actually have authority to set the performance standard for states. Each state gets to set their own performance standard. And currently, qualifying scores in states range from 35 to 41. So with our current score of 40, we're already close to the top in terms of what we are requiring. For the rest of this presentation, I'll be referring to the cut scores for the 15 rubric assessments, but the other candidates who took the 13 and 18 rubric assessments are still included in the analysis. I've scaled their scores appropriately. So if it says 40, that's just a shorthand for the score that was cut score that was in place in 2020, and 42 is shorthand for cut score that will be in place in 2021. Some notes about the data set here. This analysis includes 3 cohorts of EdPrep completers. We have individuals who completed their teacher preparation program in 2015-16, 2016-17, and 2017-18. We are currently working on collecting data from various sources for the 2018-19 cohort, but that data has not yet been assembled. The official EDTPA scores we received from Pearson, or rather the Department of Education received them from Pearson through a data sharing agreement. Only tests taken prior to August 1st, 2018 are included in this particular analysis, which means that these candidates were not required to take the EDTPA, at least not by the state. They may have been required by their EPP to take the EDTPA, but at the time that these candidates took the assessment, it was still an option to take the Praxis PLT. And only first attempts are included in this analysis, but that doesn't make a huge difference in the data set because fewer than 2% of test takers had more than one attempt on the EDTPA.
Can anyone hear me? Oh.
Now I can.
I had a question. Can you hear me clearly, or is it real?
Yes, I can hear you, Bob.
Okay. Actually, I had a question on the previous slide I was trying to get in.
Oh, sorry about that. I can go back.
Yeah. You showed the number of rubrics, and it looks like what we're looking at as our baseline is the one that's 15 because that's most subject areas. Mm-hmm. But elementary literacy and math, which appears to me to be very, very important and getting a lot of people interested in that area, has a higher EDTPA qualifying score. But are we just using the 15 as a basis? Or are we also including the one that has for elementary literacy and mathematics for the 18?
So those individuals are included in this analysis. Basically, what I did in my data set is I flagged each person's score as whether it was above the cut score that was in place at a particular time. So right now, if you took the EDTPA with 18 rubrics, your cut score is 48. And so those people would be included in the group of people who would have passed based on the 2020 cut score, which for most tests it's 40, but for that test it's 48. So they're not broken out separately from the other group, but they are included and their scores have been scaled appropriately so that the appropriate cut score is applied to them based on this chart that you see here. Okay, so when we see the percentages, 90% or something like that, that includes the 13 rubrics, the 15 rubrics, and the 18 rubrics. Yes, that does include all of them. The only ones where they're not included is if you are seeing the mean score, because in that case, having the different scales included in there would change the mean score. But if it's showing the pass rate, then those all 3 types of exams are included. Okay, thank you. So speaking of pass rates, that's what is on the next slide here. So this slide compares the pass rate for the EDTPA to the pass rate for the Praxis Principles of Teaching and Learning Assessment, which is the previously used pedagogical assessment in Tennessee. So as you can see, the pass rate based on a cut score of 37 is very similar to the pass rate on the Praxis PLT. The pass rate based on a score of 40, which that's 40, it would be based on a score of 40 if you were taking a 15 rubric assessment. If you were taking an 18 rubric assessment, it would actually be 48, but it just says 40 here so that we don't have to show 3 different versions of this table. So based on a cut score of 40, the pass rate would have been about 91% in each of those years. And based on a cut score of 42, you can see that it was down in the 80s and had been declining a little bit each year. Of course, this might have been, the results might have been different if the cut score that had actually been in place at the time was 42. The cut score these individuals actually had when they took this exam was 37. So this is just what would have happened if we retroactively applied a cut score of 42 to these groups. So this is an important time to mention that this is the type of situation where we need to think about the necessity of maintaining rigor, but we also want to make sure that we are not creating requirements that are so onerous that they are needlessly exacerbating teacher shortages. So that's a careful consideration that we need to be balancing.
Erica, this is Lillian.
Yes.
Do we have any data that that explains the drop each year if the cut score was 42? So it's been declining. It would have declined. I know it was not required, but I'm just saying, do we have any understanding of why it would have dropped, especially year over year from 16-17 to 17-18? There's a 3.7 percentage points drop. Do we have any ideas why?
We believe that's because more EPPs began to use the EDTPA in 2017-18, since that was the year before it became a requirement. And as more EPPs began using it for the first time, those new EPPs had lower average performance than the EPPs that had been implementing it for a while. So we have some more information later in the presentation about the number of people and the number of EPPs participating in EDTPA, and you will see that that increased each year, and particularly increased in 2017-18, which we suspect is why that pass rate went down.
Okay. Thank you for that.
No problem. The next slide simply shows the number of teachers that we're talking about here. So again, during this period, EDTPA was not a requirement, so this is not the total number of new teachers that we had in these years. These were just the ones who took the EDTPA. The vast majority of them scored above 42, but there were significant number who scored below 42, and particularly the number of teachers who are scoring in the 37 to 39 and the 40 to 41 range increased each year, whereas the number scoring below 37 was declining. I know it looks like it went up between 16-17 and 17-18, but as a percentage of all test takers, it continued to decline. This is showing an analysis of the first-year evaluation results for teachers based on their EDTPA score. So as you can see, there's a clear positive relationship for observation TVOS and LOE with teachers who had higher EDTPA scores performing better in their first-year observation. The symbols indicate which of these differences are statistically significant. So as you can see, the difference between the less than 37 group and the 42 plus group was statistically significant in every case. And in some cases, or in the case of observation, the 42 plus group was also statistically different from the 37 to 41 group. And in the cases where the difference was not statistically significant, it's primarily due to the fact that there were relatively fewer teachers in the lower scoring groups compared to a much larger group of teachers in the 42 plus group.
Erica, is there any data for how they are after their third year, comparing, does it mesh together, or does it, is this difference still there after 3 years? Do we know that?
So I looked at that for the data set that we currently have, and it looks like this trend is still there. Everyone gets better, but the differences were still visible. However, it's a little bit difficult to make any statistical conclusions from that at this point, just because the number of teachers we have in our data set who took EDTPA and have been teaching for 3 years is low, particularly for the low scoring groups. In the high scoring group, there's a few hundred, but there's very few of them in the low scoring group. So we'll need to watch that in the next few years once we have more teachers. Well, now that we have basically all teachers having to take the EDTPA, in a few years we will have more data on how they're doing within their first 3 years in the classroom and not just the first year.
Thank you.
Okay, so as I mentioned previously, there have been some concerns from EPPs about the diversity implications of EDTPA. So for comparison, the old assessment, the Praxis PLC, had an average gap in scores between white teachers and teachers of color of approximately 5 points, which on that test is about half of the standard deviation. And that was consistent in each of these 3 cohorts. For the EDTPA, there was a score gap of about 2 points between teachers of color and white teachers in the first 2 cohorts. That's about 1/3 of the standard deviation. So there was a gap, but it was a smaller gap than the gap we had seen in the Praxis. Then in the 2017-18 cohort, the gap essentially closed. The median for both groups was 46, and the means were very similar. We're not certain if this was just a particularly good group in 2017-18. We'll have to watch future years of data to see if this continues, but we were glad to see that this gap had disappeared. As you can see from the N sizes, there are far fewer teachers of color taking EDTPA, so it's possible for their scores, for their mean score from year to year to be somewhat volatile since they just have a smaller group.
From a percentage scale, the teachers of color versus the teachers of the white teachers, how does that, you said it's a smaller cohort group, I understand that, but from a percentage, is it about the same percentage that take the EDTPA as take the Praxis, or is that different too?
I haven't looked at that in particular, but I think it's really, it's mostly just that that's the composition of the new teaching force in Tennessee at this time. It's very heavily white with a relatively small group of teachers of color.
Thank you.
Erica,
Yes.
So one of the things that the board needs to do is decide about the cut school. But is there anything else about the bias against people of color?
Like, do I know anything else about potential bias in this exam?
Well, I'm trying to figure out the reason why people of color score lower. And
well, a possible reason.
What we would be doing about it.
Mm-hmm. One possible reason, which I have not studied personally, but that I have read about other places, is that the EDTPA involves a lot of writing. The teachers need to write write reflections about a lot of the materials that they have submitted. And it is possible that certain candidates of color have come from K through 12 schools where they did not get as strong of preparation in writing. It is also possible that there is just some cultural bias in the exam scoring, especially since in a video of teaching, you can't hide the ethnicity of the person who's doing the teaching. I know that that's something that EDTPA is working very hard on controlling and trying to eliminate.
Well, the second is something we need to pay attention to. I would hope that if any college student going into teacher prep has a deficiency from high school, that whole purpose of college prep is to prepare them to be ready to walk into a classroom when they graduate. So if they're coming in with a problem, they should not be leaving with the problem.
Mike, this is Amy, if I can jump in for 1 second. In 2018, Spencer and I called and spoke to several of the ed prep providers that had begun implementing EDTPA early, which included some of our institutions that serve higher percentages of future teachers of color. And we were able to learn a lot of really great ways that they were supporting their students, and that's something that we shared at the time, and we can certainly repeat as we identify which institutions seem to be best preparing all candidates for EDTPA, but particularly teachers of color. That's something that we can look into at the state level and help share back out as best practices.
Great.
All right, so on this slide that's currently up, you can see that there was a significant gap in the pass rate between white teachers and teachers of color based on the cut score of 37 in the 15-16 and 16-17 cohorts. This gap disappeared and actually reversed itself a little bit in the 2017-18 cohort. We are not certain if this represents a one-time occurrence or if this is a larger trend. We're hopeful that it's part of a trend of teachers of color performing better on this exam, but we will have to wait and see what future years of data show.
So we'll look and see kind of all the demographics, what drove that. I mean, that's quite an increase from 87.5 to 97.1%. Not only did it flip it, but like I say, I mean, it blew by it. So do we have a group that's looking at that data to see what caused that?
Well, we have not started this yet, but as Amy mentioned, we are planning to potentially repeat a study that we did a couple of years ago where we just talked with EPPs that were implementing EDTPA early about how they were supporting candidates. And if we repeat that study, we could certainly look for examples of EPPs that are doing particularly well, preparing candidates of color. And also one possible reason for this, although it probably doesn't quite explain the entire change, is that our early implementers, a few of our early implementing EPPs are among the more diverse EPPs in the state. And so it's possible that they have learned what is necessary to help best support their candidates of color, whereas some of the newer EPPs that have just recently started implementing EDTPA may not have as many candidates of color.
Okay.
Erica, do you have the number of early adopters? I think we mentioned that they would show up in other slides, but I do not recall seeing that number of the early adopters.
For this presentation's purposes, we're considering 8 EPPs as early adopters, and I will be listing them out later, but they were EPPs that began implementing EDTPA in 2013-14, which was the first year that it was operational at the national level.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so just to show what would have been the case if we retroactively applied the cut score of 42 to these groups, again, there would have been a substantial gap in pass rates between white teachers and teachers of color in the first 2 cohorts, but that gap disappeared in the 2017-18 cohort. This is just a national comparison of average EDTPA scores. As you can see, Tennessee has consistently done better than the national average, but both the national average and the Tennessee average have gone down just a little bit over this 3-year period, probably because the number of people taking the assessment has increased and more EPPs have begun implementing it. And as we've mentioned before, when they first begin implementing, their average score is lower. The number of EPPs in Tennessee that have been using EDTPA has steadily increased. So there are approximately 40 EPPs in the state. This chart includes the 39 that received a report card this year. In 2017-18, 32 of those EPPs had at least one EDTPA submission. Some of them had virtually all of their candidates doing EDTPA, while a few of them were just starting and with having a few of their candidates do it, but the vast majority of EPPs had at least one EDTPA submission, whereas back in 2015-16, only 11 EPPs had EDTPA submissions. So this indicates that EPPs are preparing or were preparing for the upcoming requirement of EDTPA becoming a requirement for nearly all endorsement areas on January 1st, 2019. We're certainly appreciative that they were being proactive and getting prepared for this requirement to come into effect.
I know you showed before that you compared the praxis scores with the EDTPA scores. Is there a cohort of people who took both the praxis and the EDTPA, and do you have a comparison of that?
There likely is a cohort of people who took both. I've not specifically looked at that, though I could look at it probably within a few days. The one thing I would maybe caution about that is it's possible that the people who took both only took the praxis after already failing to pass the EDTPA, since at the time you could do either one.
I know. I mean, I think it would be interesting to find out if there's a percentage of people who do pass one and don't pass the other one. Is that a large difference or large percentage? That might be valuable information to have.
Yeah, I could look into that, especially since those people well, not those exact people, but people in a similar situation now would not be able to do the Praxis PLT anymore as a substitute for the EDTPA. Okay, so here is our comparison of early implementers to later implementers. And those 8 EPPs that we consider early implementers are Austin P, East Tennessee State, University of Memphis, Middle Tennessee State, Tennessee Tech, Tennessee State, University of Tennessee Knoxville, and Vanderbilt. And I can send you that list in written format if you would like. All other EPPs are considered to be later implementers. So as you can tell from that list, most of the early implementers were large public institutions, with the exception of Vanderbilt. And so a lot of the smaller and private institutions implemented EDTPA slightly later, although some of them have at this point all been implementing it for multiple years. They just did not start all the way back in 2013-14 when EDTPA first became operational. So the number of people from early implementers who submitted EDTPA scores in 2017-18 was 1,000, and their pass rate at the cut score of 37 was extremely high at 98%. As you can see, their pass rate would have been lower at higher cut scores, but they still are significantly outperforming the candidates who are attending EPPs that implemented EDTPA later.
And as we think about this is one of the reasons back in 2018 why the board decided to phase in the higher cut scores for EDTPA. The discussion at that time was that we did not want to penalize students who just happened to be at their EPP, as the EPP was also having a learning curve with implementing EDTPA. So that was the reason for the phased-in cut score in the first place. And we can see that that trend held true with the longer that programs have been implementing, the higher cut scores they're likely to have.
The other thing, too, when you look at early implementers, we just talked about, most of them began in 2013, I believe you said that, Erica?
Yes.
And with almost 7 years of offering EDTPA, they would have lost 107 teachers at the 87.3% if we went with cut score 42 earlier for them, if you think about that. So that certainly is a large number, and I think that has to factor into our discussion today.
Could you repeat that again, that number, please?
Okay, when you look on this page, the early implementers began in 2013. That's almost, well, depending on when they started, but it's probably 6.5 to 7 years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at a cut, the column to the right with the cut score of 42, 873 would have been given their endorsement. We would have lost 107 from, I think I did the calculation based on year over year. Yeah, the previous, at the cut score of 40. That's a huge number, especially for a group that's been doing this for 7 years, if we had implemented the 42 earlier. Does that make sense? Yeah. Because these late implementers, they've not been doing it very long, right? Some of them maybe started earlier, but only in the last 2 years or so. We know they were required in January of 2019. I think that needs to factor into our discussion today. Did that make sense?
I think that's why it's important, though, to know how effective those teachers are, have been over the years. Those that, if you took a cut score of 37, like you say, you would have another 100 and something teachers versus a cut score of 42. Those that didn't score the 42 were they effective teachers with the students and progressing the students, or were they ineffective teachers and maybe shouldn't have been gotten their license? That's the piece of information I see that we're missing.
Well, exactly, and we've talked about this in the past, and having that information to make an informed decision is critically important in my humble opinion, because it could very well be that those that are scoring at a 37, that the vast majority are effective or highly effective teachers, but we need to know that. Thank you.
Erica, this is Sarah. Can you go back to the slide where you did have some information about correlations between different components of the evaluation system and the cut scores? I think that would be important to think through as we've talked about this. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So as you can see, there is a relationship here. It is not, like the differences are not gigantic. So it's not that the teachers who are scoring below 42 are all doing very poorly. They're just on average doing slightly less well than the teachers who scored above 42.
But that's why it's important to know what the standard deviation is. You know, one standard deviation is 36% or whatever it is. Two standard deviations is 95%, I think, or something. So seeing the numbers there, 3.64 LOE for a score of 42 doesn't look a whole lot different than 3.28, but until you understand what that standard deviation is, you can't really tell where they fall in the mix of things. And then again, I think it's important to understand why maybe 3 years down the road, or 4 years, or 7 years, they all mesh together and they're all at 3.64. And if that's the case, then it's more important for them to have the experience out in the field than it is to have that cut score.
Precisely.
Yeah, that's a good point, Bob. I do think we've seen and we've heard in our qualitative research or conversations with EPPs that there really is a learning curve at the institution level in terms of preparing educators for this different type of assessment, because it's much more a performance-based assessment as it is, you know, an on-the-computer practice-like test. So I think there is a distinct learning curve that plays out in this data in terms of our EPPs and their support and for these candidates over time.
Okay. Oh, yes. So this next slide shows a comparison of the various states that border Tennessee and their policies regarding EDTPA. So the only border state that requires EDTPA for virtually all of their teacher candidates is Georgia, and their cut score is currently set at 38. Both Alabama and North Carolina require candidates to do a performance-based assessment with EDTPA as one option. So if they don't do EDTPA, they have to do a similar type of assessment that's also not just a multiple choice, but involves actually demonstrating pedagogical skills. And they have cut scores of 37 and 38, respectively. Arkansas requires EDTPA for a specific alternative certification program that they administer, but they don't require it for their candidates in general. And then other border states currently do not require EDTPA.
Erica, this is Lillian. Do we have any idea of their plans to increase their cut score over time?
At this point, no. I saw that, so I have reviewed a list of state policies on EDTPA cut scores, and Tennessee was one of only a couple of states that had a phase-in approach with cut scores. New York was another example that had a phased-in approach, but the majority of states just had a single cut score in their policy and did not have any official plans to raise their score. They may be planning to raise their score, but they haven't put that in policy in the way that Tennessee has.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm thinking something totally unrelated, although it may very well should be related. is something like literacy scores for Tennessee compared to our joining bordering states. If everybody's doing the same thing, sounds to me, and we're looking at sort of, well, everybody does it, or we're going to be a little bit better than everybody else. It ought to be reflected in the student outcomes, should it not? Or if not, why are we doing it?
Yeah, that is an important point. One thing that I'm not certain about is how long these particular requirements have been in place in these neighboring states. We know how long Tennessee has been implementing EDTPA, which at a statewide level is not very long, but there are some EPPs that have been implementing it for a while. So we could potentially...
I was thinking we know let's just assume that we are all at the same level in teacher prep and cut scores, whether there is some variation. I'm thinking we're pretty close on literacy. One may be further down than the other or something like that, but within a range, we're all pretty much doing not too good, right? Anywhere in the United States is a total population. So as we think about this, I wouldn't mind getting another set of data that just shows what numbers ultimately we're going to try to be moving.
Okay, so you would be interested in seeing information about literacy scores in different states and compared them with their cut scores that they have for teacher assessment.
Just going forward, we don't want to do it right now because it's not, like you said, they haven't been in place long enough. But it does help if we're going to look at how other states, including the border states, are lining theirs up, then we ought to look at how their students are doing aligned.
Yes, that sounds like a good idea.
So let me make sure I understand what you're saying, Mike, because I think, so you're saying, can you correlate the EDTPA score with the literacy scores or the math scores that the students eventually get?
I don't know if you can or not. I think ultimately, in my brain, a reason a doctor has to pass his national board is so that he doesn't have mortality morbidity rate that is unacceptable, and that we ought to be preparing teachers at a level that produces outcomes that ultimately we're looking for. That's how we got into this thing in the first place.
Mike,
I don't think we could do it right now and it be meaningful, but it is something to track, and I'd like to kind of know where they are right now, and just glance and see what their historic us and their
Mike, this is Amy. I'm thinking that NAEP would be the only version of a nationally normed assessment we have where we could look at that. We could certainly get you comparisons of NAEP scores across Southeast peer states, but when we think about NAEP, as a sample within each state that takes the exam, so it'll be students who have both veteran teachers who were licensed long before EDTPA was even thought of, as well as some newer teachers for whom EDTPA would have been a requirement. So I don't know that that's going to be the exact proxy you're looking for, but we can try to think of some creative ways as well.
I would be happy. It's pretty simpleton thinking, but how many people in these surrounding states and Tennessee scored below 19 on reading in the ACT? Starting in pre-K and coming all the way through 12, that's sort of one of the big landmines. And why are we not? Bob mentioned earlier that in the elementary we're that literacy number along with math is a pretty big number. I mean, pretty big issue, and I'm glad to hear that we're keeping that, or maybe we're not considering, maybe we are considering maybe lowering that. I'd like to know what these eventually could happen. You know, I'd kind of like to know what California at 41 looks like, and how long they've been there. All right, I'm cutting this thing off.
Yeah, well, I could certainly try to find that ACT information for you. As Amy mentioned, it would be difficult to draw like a direct relationship between that and EDTPA scores, since the majority of students would have been taught by teachers who entered the profession before EDTPA was in place. But we could still look at how they're doing on the ACT.
Okay, shall we move on?
Yes, I'm going to move on to conclusions. So when Tennessee's EDTPA cut score increases to 42 on January 1st, 2021, Tennessee will have the highest cut score in the country. Tennessee, as I showed earlier on the national comparison slide, has consistently had a higher average EDTPA score than the national average. So we've been doing fairly well compared to other states. The number of people taking EDTPA has increased recently, and as that has happened, the average score has declined, which is likely due to the learning curve involved with introducing EDTPA at an EdPrep program. The score gap between white teachers and teachers of color appears to be closing. We hope that that trend will continue. And EPPs that were early implementers of EDTPA have higher average scores and pass rates. So it's likely that EDTPA or the EPPs that implemented EDTPA more recently will improve their average scores and pass rates over time. And regarding next steps, the main thing to consider is if Tennessee should continue with its current plan to raise the cut score to 42 on January 1st, 2021. As Chairman Hartgrove mentioned, it appears that it takes quite a while for EPPs to acclimate to EDTPA, and even so, they still have a significant number of candidates who at this time are not reaching the cut score of 42. However, 42 is the professional performance standard recommended by the makers of EDTPA. At the same time, it is important to keep measurement error in mind. All tests have some degree of measurement error, and that is why the recommended range for cut scores recommended by Pearson, that is 37 to 42, and not just specifically 42. No state currently has a cut score of 42, and Tennessee's cut score of 40 is the second highest in the nation. California's cut score is 41, and it has currently the highest cut score in the nation. I can take questions now, but in the interest of time, we also may want to move on to the next presentation.
Well,
this is Lillian, though. I think we might want to take a moment or two to get the pulse of our other committee members and myself regarding the desire to go forward with the 42 as the cut score that we recommended for 2021, or dialing it back and maintaining 40 for another period of time, whether it's a year or two or whatever. So I'd like to talk about that for a moment to get the pulse, as I indicated. Does that sound fair?
Sure, yes.
all right, so let's go first.
Okay, please.
So this is Victoria Herpel for Mike Kraus. I think we would be really interested in the data to know if those with a 37 or less than a 42 are effective, because I think we're with you all that we want high standards, absolutely, but we don't want to exclude teachers that are great teachers because of an arbitrary score. if it turns out to be arbitrary. So I think we would really appreciate continuing looking at that.
Thank you for that, Victoria. Mike, were you also getting ready to speak your opinion?
Now, do we have any sense of what the teacher shortage is and where they are and what consequence that would have in actual numbers?
So, Mike, I know at TOS, the superintendent's organization, surveyed all districts as of last, I want to say November, about what their teacher shortages looked like. And it really varied across the state. In some places, they actually even have shortages of elementary teachers, which is not what we traditionally think of. And we know that there are also shortages of math and science teachers, special ed, ESL, and so forth. I think what's the big question right now is also what our current public health situation is going to do, both to the hiring demand for teachers, and also, frankly, I think that next fall might be a challenging time if I'm a senior or if I'm, going into my final year of my ed prep program. Being able to work with students might look differently even in the coming school year, as much as we hope it doesn't. So that's one concern, frankly, that I have about raising the cut score specifically at this time, just for the situation that we're all in.
Are we considering lowering from 40?
We're at 40 right now. I don't think we're talking about lowering it. I think we're talking about not raising it to 42.
Okay. As long as we're not talking about lowering.
Well, and Mike, I know that that's definitely a concern. Erica actually identified 2 states where they did have to backtrack and lower a cut score because of low numbers of people passing. Erica, which were those 2?
Yes, that was Illinois and New York. So I mentioned previously that New York also has a ramp-up system for their cut score, and they actually implemented that after they initially implemented a cut score of 41 statewide, and their pass rates on that were low enough that they decided that they needed to backtrack and reduce their cut score and then gradually ramp it back up to 41 over a period of several years. So they're currently at 39, but they had previously been at 41 and had to reduce.
Do we know what their pass rate is at 39?
I do not know that, but I could potentially find that out.
I'd like to know.
Okay.
Lillian?
Yes, Bob?
Yeah, I'd like to. Mike, are you done?
I'm done.
Okay. So here's my thought on it, is that obviously we want to have the highest quality teachers that we can get, and having the highest cut scores anecdotally implies that we've got the best quality teachers there are in the nation if we're number 1 or number 2 in the nation. However, I don't think we have the data that compares specifically the cut score to the level of effectiveness of the teacher. We have some data, for the first year or something like that, but I think we got to look down the long term. I think we need 3-year data. I think we need 5-year data to truly see what that impact is. And to raise the cut score from 40 to 42 right now in a time period that we have a critical shortage of teachers, I think, and I think the numbers at that November meeting, Amy, there was well over 600, and that didn't even include Shelby County schools and stuff like that. So I think the shortage is in the is over 1,000, and to take out 123 teachers or whatever the number is, that we don't know if they're going to be effective or not. We've got an evaluation system to take those that aren't effective and get them out of the system in the first 3 years. So my feeling is, yes, I don't want to lower the cut scores because I want to maintain the high standard, but I wouldn't raise them at this point in time with so much uncertainty of where we are. That's kind of my thought process.
And Mike, you're in agreement with that?
Absolutely.
So I think we could make that recommendation. And then from a policy perspective, Amy, Sarah, then we would look to make that change. Tell us what we need to do next.
I think if the subcommittee is in agreement on that, it would be something that our board staff can work with the department to revise the professional assessments policy to reflect what we're discussing here today. I think that policy was going to be on the July agenda on first reading anyway. Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, for some new license types. So that's something that we can look into between now in the July meeting for first reading, and we will also make sure to communicate this intention clearly with EPPs to get any feedback or any thoughts or additional ideas that they have so that they know the direction that at least the subcommittee is intending to go. And then when we discuss the item with the full board, we'll of course give an opportunity to you three as members of the subcommittee. We'll share a truncated version of this, obviously, about what's leading to this recommendation, and then you all can chime in as well with why the subcommittee is suggesting that we move in this direction.
Okay, great, thank you.
Does that give us enough time, or not us, but does that give candidates and EP time to, is it 2 readings?
It is. So that would be in July. We typically do have a called meeting in August or September. If not, final reading would be in November. So I think it would be up to the board in July to, if the full board is really in favor of this, to make that statement where people could essentially begin planning for the cut score to be lower. But we would need to wait for the board's second vote for that to be official.
Sounds good to me. Are we in a position where we can move forward?
I'll just say one last thing. I think we ought to continue to get the data, though. I mean, I know Mike was a big pusher on the increasing cut scores, and I support him on that. I don't think we have the data to do that right now. I do think over the next years we ought to continue to get data so we can continue to move forward.
We should be able to get much more data now that it has become a statewide requirement.
Great, thank you. I know we've gone over time, but this has been a good discussion. I think it was important to go deeply in this discussion. So, Erica, are you and Amy ready to move on to the next agenda item, the report card?
Yes.
Thank you.
And we'll keep this very brief. We discussed this in depth at the December subcommittee, but we did want to share some updates on the production of the 2019 EdPrep report card. And as a reminder, we produced it in February of 2020, but it's looking back, which is why we label it the 2019 report card. We'll briefly remind you of the reasons we made some updates this year. Erica will walk you through an enhanced version of the website, and then we'll talk about our next steps. This is just our usual slide as a reminder that we have 2 different sides of EdPrep reporting. The state board report cards are the public-facing side, required by law, and are really used by a variety of stakeholders to access information about EdPrep across the state. The DOE annual reports, which Michael will talk about shortly, are much more detailed and go to each EPP directly for program improvement decisions. And the accountability mechanism is tied to the annual reports. If an EPP does not meet expectations for 2 years in a row on annual reports, it triggers an interim review process. With that, as you know, as we discussed in December, we've historically had 3 main groups that have been looking at the educator prep report card. We know our EPPs have looked at it. We know legislators and other state level leaders use it. And we know that advocacy and other community groups have been very interested. We really want to expand the audience to include prospective teacher candidates who are looking for information about where they'd like to go for their EdPrep experience, school level leaders and district level leaders who work in partnership with their area EPPs and who are thinking about where they can hire new teachers or maybe send folks for additional training or endorsement areas. So as we talked about in December, we did a comprehensive process of getting feedback from the stakeholder groups along with our advisory council. That led to some different prioritizations in our scoring framework that Erica will describe briefly, and really a new look and feel for the report card website, which she'll walk you through as well.
Okay, so this is a chart showing the revised scoring framework for the report card this year. The major changes include that admissions assessments, while they're still reported, are no longer scored. So that's the SAT, ACT, and Praxis score assessments. The reasoning behind that is just that the minimum scores on those are set in policy. So it's already required for EPPs to be meeting that, and is not, so therefore it's not a very good differentiator among EPPs. Those 3 points have been reallocated to racial and ethnic diversity, which we continue to hear from our particularly district stakeholders is a high priority for them. For employment, we have reallocated the points from first-year employment to third-year retention. The reasoning behind that is that many EPPs have particular missions, such as preparing teachers for private schools or religious schools, and therefore they might have a low first-year employment rate in Tennessee public schools, but they're still meeting their particular mission. And we don't want to penalize them for that, but we do want to make sure that the teachers they are sending to Tennessee public schools have staying power. So we have added those points onto third-year retention. And finally, under provider impact, we have reversed the point values for observation and TBOS scores so that the score of 3+ is now worth the most points. The reasoning for that is just that 3 is considered to be meeting expectations, and while 4 and 5 are what we really do want to be aiming for, it is also a very high bar for a brand new teacher to meet, and it may take a couple of years for a new teacher to advance to that level in their practice. So moving on to the next page, this is just a quick screenshot of what the report card landing page used to look like, so that you can have that in your mind for comparison. And now I'm going to, I think I need to stop sharing my screen for a moment in order to share something different. So just one moment, please. Not that one. This one. All right. Do you see the report card? It says, "Where will you begin?"
Yes.
Oh, okay. So this is what the new report card landing page looks like. As you can see, it's been totally redesigned. You can, on this landing page, just see some basic information about statewide number of programs and number of educators prepared. But then where you really get into the details is if you click on Browse Programs. And here, a nice feature that we have added this year is there's the ability to filter. For example, if you want to see specifically programs in Nashville, you can apply this filter and it will zoom in, and then you can browse different programs just in the Nashville area. You could also, down here on the side, you can indicate if you're interested in a public, private, or alternative program. You can search for particular endorsement areas. So like if I want to get endorsed in chemistry, I can search for which EPPs offer that. And then as an example of what the report card looks like for each EPP, I'm going to click on UT Knoxville. So you start here with their profile page. EPPs get to supply this descriptive text about their program. And then we have added in information about the endorsement areas that they offer. You can see a map of where their recent completers have been placed across Tennessee, and information about how many teachers they've had in their last 3 cohorts of completers. Up at the top, under overall performance, you can click on overview to see how they did overall. As you can see, UT Knoxville was exceeding expectations. And then scrolling down, you can see their performance in each of the 3 scored domains on the report cards. To get more information about those, you can click on them and see the specific metrics that make up that domain. So in this case, for the candidate profile domain, this EPP is meeting expectations. You can see the racial and ethnic diversity of this EPP, and scrolling down, you can see what percentage of their candidates were passing their admissions assessments, which, as I mentioned, is no longer scored but is still reported. You can see their percentage of racially diverse completers and their percentage of candidates getting high demand endorsements. We have a similar page for the other scored domains. So this is the provider impact domain, which is the evaluation scores. So you can see the percentage of their candidates that got level 3 or above on their observations, also level 4 or above, and you can see similar information for TVOS and for LOE, with LOE being unscored because it's primarily a combination of those other two factors. You can also view disaggregations. So on this particular metric, you can see that for TVOS, the most recent cohort had the lowest percentage, getting a score of 3+, which this is basically what we expect to see, because as the teachers gain experience in their first 3 years in the classroom, they progressively do better. We have 2 new domains that we've added this year, which are currently unscored but may be scored in the future. One of these is candidate assessment. So this is referring to assessments that are required for licensure. On this page, you can see the pass rate for the CPP's candidates on the Praxis PLT, the EDTPA, and Praxis subject area assessments. As I noted in my previous presentation, UT Knoxville was an early implementer of EDTPA, and you can see here that their pass score, or their pass rate on EDTPA, is very high. The other new domain is satisfaction, which takes data from the Tennessee Educator Survey, which is put out by the department and TARA every year. And there's a particular module on that survey that's for teachers in their first 3 years of teaching. And it asks them about their educator preparation experience and how prepared they felt by it. So you can see on this page how the completers of this EPP, who are now in their first 3 years of teaching, responded to this survey. The other feature I want to highlight here is we have a state report which shows the overall performance of EPPs in the state. So this chart here, that's not showing percentages, but that's showing number of EPPs that scored at each performance level. And scrolling down, you can see the number of EPPs at each performance level for the various domains. Similar to the individual EPP report card, you can click on the various domains to see how the state as a whole is doing. And finally, there's also the leader preparation module, which looks similar to the teacher prep page, except that there's not quite as many programs, but you can still filter them by geography or by public and private. And if you click on one, we don't have as many details as for teacher prep programs, and these leader prep pages are not scored, but you can see the description of the program provided by the EPP. You can see how many completers the program has had, and you can see information about diversity in the program and the pass rate on the Praxis School Leaders Licensure Assessment. So that's just a quick tour. I'm going to unshare this screen and reshare the PowerPoint presentation again.
And Erica, while you're doing I'm not sure why we get an echo when I speak, but I'll take it off of speakers if this is better. So this is not live yet, correct? The new.
Oh, this is live. It has been live since February 14th.
Wow. Okay.
And yes, so you are free to visit it at any time. It is required by statute that we release this report before February 15th each year, and so this year we released it on February 14th.
That's right, but I did not realize, I don't recall seeing the changes that you made to the report the visual, the website. So I'm personally incredibly impressed with what I'm seeing. I like the new look. I like the new feel. It seems more user-friendly, easy to navigate through, additional data that I think is important as an ed prep or any individual looking at it, especially someone thinking about going to a particular ed prep program, can view more detailed information, at least from my lens. And so if you gave us a tour before, this is the first time I recall seeing it, and I just want you to know I'm very impressed. So did you design this by yourself? Did you get input from others? How did you go about coming up with the new look and feel? I'm very curious.
Well, I certainly cannot take credit for the new look. The design of the report card was done by our web vendor who knew it, but the new features that are available, like the filtering and the map, those were things that we specifically requested based on feedback that we had received from stakeholders over the past year as we were working on this redesign. So my role in this was really the data that is behind the scenes. I did not design the website myself, but
okay.
Amy and I both provided input on the website design, and we're very happy with how it turned out.
I am too. And have you gotten any feedback from anyone utilizing it, especially EdPrep?
The EdPreps generally seem to like the new look, although they also are very focused on their data, and they care a lot more about their data than specifically how the website looks.
Of course.
We appreciate
naturally.
It's the important thing
Understandable.
is that things are moving in the right direction in terms of the data. We were able to, we're working currently with SCORE to write several blog posts with them about different ways that audiences can use the report card. So we're very excited to share that out. And Elizabeth was just a hero in comms for us in February in terms of sharing this out on social media and in print publications as well. So we've been doing our best to share it far and wide and to make it something that is useful year-round. We tend to get more interest and press around this in February when it first comes out, but we think that it's something that could be useful to different audiences throughout the year.
Great.
Lillian,
Thank you.
Lillian, this is Bob. And
yes, Bob.
I don't know if you recall that I actually represent the board on the advisory council for
yes.
this, and I think Eric and Amy understate their contributions here, but they brought the revised page and information to the advisory council. That's how we came up with the scores too, the point scores using the advisory council's input to that. They've got a lot of input, but they've done an exceptional job. And I do think the advisory council believes that it's a much better product. Of course, the goal is for the students, the future students, to use it in deciding what universities that they'll go to too.
Thank you for adding that, Bob, because I believe what you say is true, because there's no way that a vendor could do this level of work without the great work of Amy and Erica. So thank you for adding that. Okay, moving on, Erica, back to you.
Wait.
Unless somebody else has a comment. Is that Mike speaking?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
I too think it's awesome. It's user friendly, and when you're really wanting to go to Main Street for usage, it needs to be. Which brings me to comment Bob was saying. We need to really know and figure out how to get this into the hands of people who are considering going in to be a teacher while they're in high school. In my, the easy thing, I don't know what your market penetration would be for in guidance counselor's office, and start directing people to it. So they not that we're handing them out this in paper form, but just people aren't going to know this exists. I'm sorry, unless we really drive it to them. If we drive it to them, this is going to have immense value to those people. This is great stuff.
I agree. I agree with you 100%. Anything else, Mike?
Could we have a sort of a plan on how we're going to do that?
We have talked about that. I know the Department of Education typically has somebody in the role of coordinating school counselors, so we've talked about reaching out to an individual in that role. There's also a state school counselors association, so I think that we have several avenues we could work with. We've also worked with the state HR personnel administrators, so people who work in HR for school districts, because they might have candidates who are already teaching or who are maybe a paraprofessional thinking about going to get an endorsement or an additional endorsement or even something in the leader prep area. So I appreciate the comment, Mike. It is very well taken.
And Mike, this is Sarah. We will put our heads back together. You know, this report came out right after your all's last board meeting, and then, you know, it's been pretty crazy since then, but I think there are a number of concrete steps we can take additionally, especially given that this year's report is so much more user-friendly. We want to make sure it's getting into the hands of those high school counselors and other potential teacher candidates and people who are supporting potential teacher candidates. So we'll come back to you with some action steps there. But like Amy said, I think there's a number of additional steps we could take. We do want to make sure we're sharing this with the right folks.
Awesome.
While I'm unmuted, just a couple other quick comments, Madam Chair, if I have just a minute. I, too, am incredibly proud of our team and the stakeholder feedback we've been able to collect and the way this report continues to evolve. I think it's really headed in the right direction. For obvious reasons, as you all know, without state testing data this spring, there's a number of considerations that we'll have to work through for next year's report, and we certainly don't want to be in a place of penalizing anyone for a lack of data there on the student achievement component. So there will be some decisions ahead of us as a state board in terms of what next year's report will need to look like and what it can include and what we will not be able to include. So just anticipate those decisions coming forward related to this report for the 2019 school year.
Thank you for adding that information, Sarah. That's important. Anything else? I know we have a next steps slide. Is there anything else you all want to cover on that slide?
I don't think so. Unless anyone else has anything to add, I'll just move on to next steps, which basically we're going to continue gathering feedback from our EPP partners. This is something that we do all the time, not just every now and then when we're doing a major redesign, to identify ways that we can continue to make this tool better. And we are also beginning the data collection process for the 2020 report card, which, as Amy mentioned earlier, the 2020 report card will be released in February of 2021. But we have currently pulled the new 2018-19 cohort data out of TN Compass, and this summer EPPs will have the opportunity to review that and supply additional information. And then the TDOE staff and myself will work on reviewing and cleaning the data submitted by EPPs and then merging in data from the department about employment, licensure assessments, and candidate satisfaction. Normally, we would also be merging in student assessment data, but since we will not have any of that this year, as Sarah mentioned, we're going to have to think about how we're going to manage that.
Very good. Anything else? Any other questions or comments? If not, I know we are way behind on our schedule. And thank you so much, Erica and Amy. Great presentation, great work, a lot of research. And I thank you for that. So next up is Michael Durline with the Tennessee Department of Education annual reports and some TDOE updates. Michael?
Hi, everyone. Michael Durline, Senior Director of Educator Licensure and Preparation at the department. Welcome to my dining room. I am going to share some content. Let's make sure I can do this. There we go. Everybody see PowerPoint slide here?
Yes.
Great. Yes. So I'm going to go through a few brief updates regarding annual reports. I'm going to turn it over to David to provide an introduction to a potential map proposal that we'd like to talk through today. I'll share some of the details of that proposal. And then we'll have a brief discussion about July's meeting, which will include a number of recommendations for EPPs that have been reviewed over the last 6 months or so. So annual reports are a bit delayed. The individual who works in STS, a state agency that produces them, actually had a direct hit from the tornado. And then following that, obviously, we've had some delays with the coronavirus. However, we are on track to release them next week. They are currently being reviewed for accuracy, and we have our IT team working to provide secure access through our TN Atlas platform. We have not changed the metrics in any substantive way, but we now have 3 years of performance reports. Those performance reports in our comprehensive reviews that we held last fall have been critical for that process. So I think in a previous subcommittee meeting, I kind of talked through the integration of our metrics into our program review process. So it's not just an inputs-driven process or a qualitative process. We're really integrating that data and those metrics into the decisions, the recommendations that you all will get in July. So we are really excited to release those next week. I know EPPs are, as I believe Eric had noted, they are very interested in getting into their data, and annual reports provide them that tool to dig even deeper than the report card. Looking ahead to 2020 annual reports, as Erica mentioned, we're working closely with board staff to begin the data collection process. And now that we have 3 years of performance reports, we really want to engage the Educator Preparation Working Group, much like State Board staff did with the Advisory Council, to revisit some of the metrics. I know we've had some questions come up about certain metrics within annual reports, and now that we have 3 years of data, also now that we've used these for comprehensive reviews, we can get a better sense of are some metrics in need of revision or dropping? Are there some things that we're not capturing that we need to be? With that, we're hoping to hire a new director of data and research. Jack Powers was on our team for about a year and recently transitioned to another team within the department. So we are actively searching for kind of our point person on these reports that will support both production of the annual reports and the State Board staff in production of the report card. Happy to take any questions on this before we jump into a totally different topic.
Any questions? Mike?
No, I'm good.
You're good? I saw you waving.
I was waving off.
Okay, thank you. Continue, Michael. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, I'll turn it over to David. Hopefully, David, are you there?
I see him, but he's muted. Aha.
All right. Am I off mute now?
You are off mute.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate the time today. And actually, some of the questions brought up earlier about vacancies in the state is a perfect segue to just start by just saying thank you to the board members and also State Board staff, Sarah and Amy. The out-of-state licensure item that was passed has already started to pay significant dividends with interested individuals from out-of-state writing us, from district representatives saying that now they're able to fill more vacancies than they had planned to because they're able to recruit out-of-state individuals easier. And some people that have actually said, especially because of COVID and the impact on the economy, the savings of $300, $400, $500 is significant when it comes to the savings from the practice exam. So I just want to thank the board for their leadership and being proactive. It's a huge help. So just I want to say thank you. With that and with continuing with the conversations around vacancies, as Amy had mentioned, she highlighted some of the areas that we're aware of that are high across the state. One of them, as we all know, is special education, and initiatives the department is focusing on in there is we have a competitive grant right now, $1 million grant for EPPs, where we will, if it all plays out the way we expect it to, every single district will be able to pick at least one teacher, current teacher, to earn their special ed endorsement for free at absolutely no cost to them. We'd even pay for the individual to take the praxis. for the registration fee. But another area of concern that we have, a subject area that Amy mentioned, is math. And so we are aware of, especially in secondary, where individuals are struggling to complete the current 612 praxis. And so what Michael and I have been thinking of is, if an intended outcome is, how do we get more students certified, high-quality math teachers? Because based on conservative estimates, we have about 10,000 students right now without a math teacher due to over 130 math vacancies. And so with that, we wanted to come to the subcommittee on licensure to begin the conversation around what could we consider to provide districts more flexibility in math without in any way, shape, or form lowering the bar, changing cut scores. We don't want to get involved in that. We appreciate the board's focus on keeping the bar high so that Tennessee only has high-quality educators. So our thought here is Michael's going to present on one idea that we have, but what I'd like to say is that we are interested in getting engaging up front and getting input up front so that we could take a first read item to the board, not in May, but actually at the meeting after that, so that we are doing extensive engagement in the field with our partners and making sure we're acting on the guidance and input and expertise of the board and state board staff. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, David. So the math proposal that we're going to walk through considers some alternative endorsement structures. So it would introduce new endorsements that don't currently exist, but as David noted, without sacrificing quality. So not necessarily lowering cut scores. You'll also see that it, as proposed, it wouldn't require EPPs to do significant redesign, which typically when we introduce new endorsements, it requires a complete restructuring by ed prep providers, which takes a good deal of time. The table that you all should have received provides two options for added flexibility with minimal impact on existing prep programs. So the proposal would create this new endorsement, which is a 610 math endorsement, so middle and early secondary grades. There would be two pathways initially to that endorsement. And it would improve some of the alignment between the assessments and endorsement grade spans and allow educators to teach the following courses: 6-8 math, Algebra 1, Geometry, Integrated Math 1, and Integrated Math 2. So they wouldn't be able to go above that 10th grade level math. As David mentioned, this would kind of be the first step in addressing the challenges faced in secondary math. So I think, like a lot of things we've done in the past, we view this as a multi-pronged approach to a challenge that we're seeing. And also, as David mentioned, we'd like to see key feedback from key stakeholder groups. We're going to host a virtual meeting of the Educator Preparation Working Group in May, and certainly we'd want to run this by folks like TOS, TASPA, and other critical groups. So I'm going to shift over to this document. Can you all see this all right?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So just focusing here on this top row, everything that's in white is what currently exists. So right now we have a middle grade 6-8 endorsement. And the tests required for that endorsement are either the Praxis Middle School assessment or the new NES Mathematics assessment. And these folks have to take the Teaching Reading assessment and the Mathematics 6-8 EDTPA. Well, what we know is that the NES Mathematics assessment, as written in the title of it, covers some early secondary content. And so the idea here is to split the 6-8 endorsement, so not change programs, but split the 6-8 endorsement into two different endorsements. Remain 6-8, keep a 6-8, and then also a 610 middle grades and early secondary endorsement. And what that endorsement would be split based on would be two things. One would be the assessment taken. So if somebody takes the NES assessment, that would be a pathway to the 610 endorsement. And 2, in this third column, you can see that because preparation programs wouldn't necessarily have any clinical practice placement in an early secondary setting, there would be a requirement that they do. So if a candidate wanted to pursue this 610 endorsement, they would both have to complete a clinical practice placement in a early secondary setting, and they would have to pass the NES mathematics middle grades and early secondary assessment. So this column here, proposed assessment, would kind of outline if you're seeking the 6-8, you have to take the praxis assessment. You would also still have to take the teaching reading assessment and the EDTPA. If you're seeking the 610, you'd have to take the NES assessment, which again is currently available. And then you'd also have to take the teaching reading and the mathematics EDTPA. So the rationale for this would be that the NES assessment covers material at that early secondary level, and it addresses some of the inflexibility of the 6-8 endorsement. So I hear often, folks reaching out to me from districts saying, can this educator with the 6-8 endorsement teach, X in some cases in my 9th grade classroom, and they can't. But I think that this pathway would allow for some of that flexibility without sacrificing quality. And then the flip of that would be looking at our 612 program. So obviously we have a significant issue with pass rates on the secondary content, math content knowledge praxis. Our pass rates are very low. Nationally, they're very low. The board did approve the new NES secondary math 612 assessment. I think it's going to take some time to see the outcomes of that assessment. So currently, folks who are in approved 612 programs can either take that praxis assessment or the NES secondary assessment, and they have to take the math EDTPA. So we would take kind of a similar approach here, split the endorsement, this time based just on assessment, because these individuals would have a clinical practice in a 610 setting. And there would be 2 different endorsements. Keep the 612 math endorsement, and then have a 610 middle grades and early secondary math endorsement. The 612 endorsement could be obtained by either taking the math praxis or the NES secondary assessment, whereas the 610 could be obtained by taking the NES mathematics middle grades and early secondary assessment. Those individuals would have to take the teaching reading assessment, and then EDTPA, either 6-8 or 612 would be required for both. So again, rationale there is that the NES assessment covers material at the early secondary level, addresses the extraordinarily low pass rate on the secondary math praxis assessment, which I think is proving to be a barrier to entry. And then it provides additional flexibility for educators and districts to recruit math teachers who may just need support in that higher level math. So if they are struggling in the pre-calculus and the calculus and the trig, this would provide a pathway for them to get into math classrooms, but not those that they may not have demonstrated competency in.
Michael, this is Bob. I have a question.
Yeah, sure, Bob.
So, as you know, we're in the process of realigning our math standards. And so with this new 6 to 10 math endorsement, do we know for a fact that it aligns well with the 6 to 10 standards?
That's a great question, Bob. This is Amy, if I can jump in.
Okay.
Most of the discussion of, in terms of the math standards review and the Tennessee Math Alignment Group, which is a group of representatives from K-12 and higher ed in the state. To my understanding, most of the conversation about potential changes, like emphasizing the importance of statistics and other things like that, are coming in the later grades of high school when we think about student pathways that are going to be most relevant for what they want to study in college or what they want to do in their career field. There is discussion of embedding some more statistics in the middle school grade bands. So I think as the standards review discussion moves forward, we'd certainly want to circle back with our assessment vendors and look at the percentages of each test that cover different topic areas and see if that aligns well with what we're going to be expecting in Tennessee in future years.
And we just need to be sure that we don't, water down the the endorsements that we end up with, teachers that can't, so that it minimizes what happens in the grades 9 and 10, for example. They move to the high school. Those are concerns that I have, I guess.
I think that's a great point to bring up, that all of these things need to be moving in conjunction with each other and not something happening over here and something else happening in a vacuum.
Right. Thank you.
That makes a lot of sense. Another just quick point I'll make there is I think in addition to looking at those assessments to make sure that there's alignment, looking at the preparation standards, the national standards that are used for preparation programs would be a thoughtful thing to do as well.
I think Mike Edwards has a question.
You mentioned this would allow a gateway to get into courses where they are competent and not be, this is my words, but not be limited because there are courses that they were not as good in, like calculus and trig you mentioned. How do we know that they've demonstrated a competency in calculus and trig?
Do you mean if they're taking the 612 secondary math praxis?
Yeah.
I think, again, it comes back to the standard setting process. So as ETS has shared, their process for standard setting includes a panel of folks who set that, I forget the exact term that they call it, but the ideal cut score, which would require demonstration of some of that content. But it is broad, right? The 612 math endorsement covers a lot of content. And so I do think that being able to focus some of the folks who are in those programs in the 610 area might actually be a really good thing. Be able to narrow that focus just a bit.
So this, rather than do this approach, which I'm not commenting on whether I like it or not, just looked at it, but would you not achieve the same deal by having people get endorsed in those individual subjects, batch them?
We've talked about that a bit. David, I don't know if you want to jump in as well. I think cost has been the biggest concern there, and accessibility. You would potentially have to take an assessment for every single area that you're seeking to get endorsed in, which could be extraordinarily costly.
We're kind of batching them here. If you had what we don't know, whether it's math, calculus, or chemistry and science or physics, we don't know if they know it or not. Well, we know it on physics, but should we add those upper level courses and would that be a financial barrier or just calculus or just, because right now they can get put in those courses if they afford it.
So, Board Member Edwards, can you hear me? This is David Donaldson. Okay, great. Sorry, I'm still struggling with the technology and the mute button. So I think that's actually, it's a great point in building off of Michael. It's something we talked about earlier this week with Executive Director Morrison and Amy Owen. The idea of if we went with this 610 option, then individual educators could actually add on, if we wanted to, we could consider having a statistics or trigonometry or pre-calc, individualized endorsements. We could work potentially with ETS or Pearson to come up with exams that assess those specific items, or we could look at stacking them if we wanted to. I think one thing that could be very interesting is an incentive model, similar to what I shared earlier about the special ed additional endorsement, where the state can leverage competitive grants so that a district could identify a strong math teacher, let's say with this 610 endorsement, and say, you know what, I think, you would be, you have the ability, you're a great teacher, kids love you, you have high rigor, we will pay for you to get your calculus add-on endorsement. We could pay for you to get your statistics add-on endorsement. What we have right now, though, is just quite simply not enough math teachers at all, when, frankly, I would say I think a high majority, and frankly, even if it's just one person, it's worth it because it means kids' lives will be changed, that could be teaching Algebra 1 right now, who could be teaching integrative math, who could be teaching geometry, but they may, be failing questions right now on the 612 math that are statistics related or are calculus related. So I think your point is well taken, that we want to be able to better assess individual strengths. And as Michael mentioned, the 610 narrows the focus of the content that they would have to show mastery on. And then we could do what you're suggesting. And I think that's the reason why we know we're going to need a solid 2 months of engagement to engage with individuals like yourself, the rest of the board, state board staff, and also, our districts to say, this is the start of a conversation. I think we're going to take a yes and approach to this while always maintaining a high bar, Board Member Edwards.
I look forward to the next 2 months.
Yes, sir.
I'll also add another tool that the board has, our employment standards. So there are pathways, these get really confusing, but there are pathways by which licensed educators can complete specific requirements that aren't necessarily going back to a preparation program, but typically do include an assessment. The Algebra 1 employment standard is an example of this, where licensed educators complete a training, they pass an assessment, and that allows them to teach Algebra 1 as a course. Typically, endorsements allow educators to teach multiple courses across various grade bands. Employment standards are a little more narrow, but what I will say with some of those employment standards is that the content can be targeted in that specific area. The assessment is targeted in that specific area. So that might also be another approach to take with some of those higher level math courses is really what we're talking about here. So just a thought there, but one of those things that I would add to the list of ideas to explore.
I would love to learn more about that. That's very, very interesting. Was that aware of it?
So this is Lillian. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry, because sometimes I get this feedback, so I have to take you off speaker. I will tell you that I do like what you're recommending here, and I do see that on your slide deck that you are talking about getting feedback from various stakeholder groups. So I will be very eager and interested in knowing what type of feedback you get, and when do you expect to begin collecting input from the various stakeholder groups?
I can say definitely next month from the EdPrep community. David, I don't have on hand exactly our next conversations with some of the district folks.
Yeah, so in 2 weeks we have what's called our kitchen cabinet with CASPA, and that's the HR Directors Association for school districts. And then I actually will also, it's a topic that will be discussed next week with a group of superintendents, one from each core region, that are part of the Best for All Strategic Plan Priority 3 working group. And then after this meeting, we wanted to make sure we had this meeting first, and then we'll be following up with the Dale Lynch's of TOSS and others. But those are some, as Michael mentioned, what I just mentioned, are scheduled meetings that these are agenda items we are interested in placing on there after this meeting.
Great, and I do see that, as you stated, that you plan to bring this to a recommendation to the state board in July. Is that correct?
Yes, Chairwoman.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions on this topic?
No other questions or comments? Great work, Michael. Thank you so much. Thank you, David, for adding to the discussion and for the work you do, too. Now, you have another piece of information you want to share with us, additional?
Yes. This will be brief. So July is going to be a very heavy month for EPP recommendations. So we have 4 state-managed reviews that we conducted last fall: Maryville, Bryan, Tusculum, and South. We had 3 Cape State joint comprehensive reviews for accreditation of UT Chattanooga, Freed-Hardeman University, and Carson-Newman, and 2 state-managed focused reviews, Johnson University and Bethel. And what I didn't put on here, we also had 2 prospective EPP reviews, so 2 entities that are seeking to become an EPP but aren't currently. So this will be so you know, that's 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 recommendations that will come before the board in July on EPPs. This is going to be the first round of recommendations that we bring under a completely revised state-managed process. I think the question for you all, in the past we have really just brought summary documents where it outlines exactly where EPPs have met and not met standards, but it's been at a very high level. We could share some of the additional detail around the findings from the report, but I think it was, you know, especially given the new state-managed process, there's more to share. So just wanted to get a sense of, for those that have been part of this process in the past, has the level of detail of information been appropriate? Is there more you'd like to see as far as what the review process looks like and the outcomes of those reviews? So just wanted to kind of throw that out there as a question.
Bob or Mike, do you want to add anything first?
I think I'm going to need to see it, and kind of what occurs to me that questions come up that it raises. A draft of something might help me.
Yeah, I agree with Mike. I need to go back and look and see what's been provided in the past and what they're proposing additional to provide here.
And I will say that what we've had in the past, I thought was sufficient for us to understand what you all had done behind the scenes to get to that particular recommendation. But again, I think more detail is not necessarily a bad thing, but it could be overwhelming by the same token. So I think whatever, if there's an in-between of not too much information and not enough, you know, somewhere striking a balance. But I think in the past, the information you shared has been sufficient from my opinion, but that may not be true of all the other board members. So I would like to, as both Bob and Mike have said, see what you may be thinking about in terms of additional information that may not be information overload, if you will.
Okay, great.
Because these are critically important decisions, and you all certainly have a lot of work to do with the number that are on this list. So our part is not so. Ours is the easier side of it, of course, and we'll ask questions, but I think what you think is striking a fair balance of the right amount of information would be what I would recommend.
Great.
And this is Sarah. We may want to consider, we'll see what the agenda looks like for July, but particularly given the fact that we have a couple new board members who aren't familiar with this review process, and like you said, Michael, it's a new state-managed process. There's a lot of programs. It could be something that we want to work onto the workshop agenda for a presentation, and that might give folks the chance to see the kind of information that you're collecting and maybe give some additional direction about what the board members might like to see moving forward on recommendations. But let's just make a note to see if that makes sense as we get closer to July.
Sure, that's helpful. Thank you.
And then, Michael, I think you and I can very briefly go over the last slides here. This is just a note that at the May board meeting, we're going to have several items relevant to educator licensure and preparation. Some of them are in response still to our public health situation, specifically the EPP rule around which LEAs may apply to become an ed prep provider. Michael, do you mind describing that briefly?
No, not at all. So the current state board rule on educator preparation allows an LEA to apply to become an EPP if they have not received the lowest performance rating on state accountability. Well, this year there won't be a state accountability measure at that district level, so this is a provision to clarify exactly which years would qualify for eligibility of an LEA to become an EPP.
So is this part of the Grow Your Own program?
No, this is just broader. So LEAs are currently eligible to be EPPs. They have to go through the same process that an institution of higher education goes through to become an EPP, but they have to demonstrate that they haven't had that low performance rating on accountability before they do so.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll have the employment standards rule and the licensure policy both on final reading. Those are on first reading in February, and we'll have some continued cleanup and clarification changes on those. But that's really it. We just wanted to make sure that you knew what was coming in the next few weeks at our May meeting at the end of the month. And you can expect those items no later than May. I think the 14th is 10 business days before the meeting, but we'll try to get anything we can to you ahead of time. And with that, Madam Chair and Sarah, if you all have any further questions, we're happy to take them, or any further suggestions for this subcommittee in the future, things you'd like to see researched.
Well, I'd like to know certainly if Bob, Evie, and Mike Edwards have anything they want to add, and then Sarah, I'll turn it over to you. Bob or Mike, is there anything else you want to see us discussing in the future?
I thought this was a very good meeting, very helpful, a lot of good information, both from state board staff as well as from the department, and I'm very satisfied with it.
Mike, anything to add or comment?
Really a great informative meeting, a lot of wisdom going on, so I'm pleased.
I am too, and it was certainly brought up in light of the math proposal, our teacher shortage, and certainly looking at it from the EDTPA cut scores. I think continuing to look at our teacher shortage and understanding the impact of decisions or any policy or rule changes that we need to be looking at, not again to lower the bar by any stretch of the imagination. We're all on the same page relative to that. But I think the continuation of getting that data, having that research, the information that can inform our decisions are critically important to all of us. So, no, this great discussion today, great meeting, a lot of great work on the part of our partners at the department and our own internal team. So thank you all so much. Sarah, anything you want to add?
No, I think it's been a great meeting too. I appreciate everybody's engagement. We've had great conversations in advance of this meeting with our partners at the Department of Education, and like the board, I share excitement about those new math pathways. So, there's a lot to be excited about, and I think both at the May meeting and the July meeting, we'll have the chance to revisit some of these conversations and bring back some more information as you all requested. So, I'm happy to give you a little look at my coworker who joined us here too before we leave.
I'd love to see your coworker.
Oh.
Charlie. Say hi, guys.
Hi, Charlie.
He's a very well behaved coworker typically, so he also thinks it's been a good discussion. But no, thanks everybody. It's been a great meeting.
Thank you. Thank you all. Michael, we didn't see your children.
No, they are holed up somewhere, which is probably just as good.
Okay. Well, it would have been fine. So thank you all again, and hope you enjoy the rest of the day. And please, as always, stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.